There's a specific kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being in a room full of people who used to know you, and realizing they still think they do. You haven't moved away. You haven't changed your phone number. But something inside you has shifted so quietly, so completely, that the distance you feel now isn't measured in miles. It's measured in who you're becoming. And no one warned you this would happen. No one told you that growth would feel, for a long time, less like expansion and more like loss. You start to see things differently. You start to react differently. You start to want different things, need different conversations, crave a kind of depth that used to not matter to you at all. And the people around you, they're still there, still laughing at the same things, still moving through the same patterns, still expecting you to be exactly who you were. But you're not that person anymore. Not entirely. And that space between who you were and who you're becoming, that's where this loneliness lives. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive like grief, dramatic and obvious. It seeps in slowly, the way cold air comes through a window you didn't realize was open. It shows up in the middle of a dinner where you realize you have nothing real to say, or during a conversation you're physically present for, but emotionally nowhere near. You smile, you nod, you perform familiarity, and then you go home and sit with a silence that feels louder than anything that was said. You replay the evening in your head, not with anger, not with resentment, but with something more subtle than both, a kind of quiet bewilderment, like you watched yourself from a distance all night and didn't fully recognize the person playing your role. And the unsettling part isn't the distance you feel from others. It's the distance you feel from who you used to be, because somewhere inside you, you still remember being completely comfortable in those spaces, completely at ease in those conversations. Somewhere inside you, there's a version of yourself that fit, that belonged without effort, that laughed without translation, that didn't carry this low hum of something unspoken into every room. And you miss that, even if you can't go back, even if you wouldn't, if you could. Here's what's strange about this kind of loneliness. It doesn't mean something went wrong. It might mean something went very, very right. Carl Rogers spent decades watching people grow, watching them move, sometimes painfully, sometimes slowly, toward what he called becoming a person, not performing one, not inheriting one from family or culture or fear, actually becoming one. And what he noticed was this: the closer someone moved toward their real self, the more certain relationships began to feel like a costume they were being asked to keep wearing, a role rehearsed so many times it started to feel automatic, lines delivered on cue, reactions predicted in advance, not because those people were bad, not because those connections weren't real, but because some connections are built around a version of you that no longer exists. And when that version begins to loosen, the structure built around it starts to wobble, and the honest question, the one that actually hurts, is whether you're willing to grieve that. Because most people aren't. Most people, the moment they feel this loneliness creeping in, do one of two things. They either rush back into the old version of themselves to make it stop, or they pretend the loneliness isn't there at all, that the distance they feel is just tiredness, just stress, just a bad week. But it isn't a bad week, it's a threshold. You've arrived at a place inside yourself that not everyone in your life has access to. Not because you're better than them, not because you're ahead of them, but because you've been willing to do something quietly terrifying. You've started looking at yourself honestly. You've allowed questions to surface that used to be buried. You've stopped automatically agreeing with narratives that once felt unquestionable. And honesty changes things. When you stop performing for people, when you stop shaping yourself around their comfort or their expectations, when you let yourself want what you actually want and feel what you actually feel, the social architecture of your life begins to shift. The unspoken agreements are disrupted, the familiar rhythms change, and what once felt smooth can suddenly feel tense. Some people can feel that shift, and they don't like it, not because they want to hurt you, but because your growth is, somehow, a mirror. And not everyone wants to look, so they push back, sometimes with humor, sometimes with subtle criticism, sometimes with that particular silence that says, "Who do you think you are now?" And the strange thing about that question is how much power it still holds. even when you know it isn't fair, even when you understand, intellectually, what's happening. That voice, whether it comes from someone else or from inside your own head, still lands somewhere soft, because part of you, the old part, the conditioned part, the part that learned a long time ago that belonging requires performance, that part wants to shrink back, wants to reassure everyone that you're still safe, still familiar, still the person they can predict. That pull is real. Don't dismiss it. It's not weakness. It's what Rogers called the actualizing tendency meeting the conditions of worth. The moment your need to grow collides with your need to be loved. And for most people, that collision is quiet, internal, and deeply exhausting. It's the tension between expansion and attachment, between authenticity and approval. It happens in small moments, in the split second before you say something true and then decide not to, in the way you soften your edges before walking into certain rooms, in the smile you put on not because you feel it, but because you know it makes things easier. These aren't dramatic betrayals. They're tiny ones, but they accumulate, and over time, that accumulation starts to feel like a weight you can't quite name, a low-grade fatigue that no amount of sleep seems to touch. You begin to notice it in subtle ways, a hesitation before sharing good news, a careful editing of opinions, a sense of relief when plans are canceled because it means you don't have to manage yourself. These signals are quiet, but they're honest. And what's harder still is that the people asking you to shrink usually aren't doing it consciously. They're not villains. They're people who found something familiar in you and are now quietly, instinctively, trying to hold on to it. Because when you change, their world shifts too. The dynamic shifts. The mirror shifts. And that's uncomfortable for anyone who hasn't been doing their own work. If any of this is landing somewhere real in you, if something in these words is touching a place you haven't known how to name, you're not alone in that. There are people sitting with this exact weight right now. People who found this video for the same reason you did. If this channel is becoming a space where your inner life feels less strange, less isolated, you're welcome here. That's what this space is for. But back to that pull, that urge to make yourself smaller so others don't feel uncomfortable. What does it cost you to do that? Not in theory, not philosophically, in actual daily life, in the accumulation of moments where you folded yourself inward to keep the peace. What does that cost? There's a cost to constantly translating yourself, a cost to filtering your intensity, a cost to pretending indifference toward things that matter deeply to you. And the longer you pay that cost, the more it compounds. Not in visible drama, but in quiet disconnection from yourself. There's a version of you that never finds out, that keeps folding, keeps softening, keeps adjusting, and one day wakes up at 50 or 60 and realizes they've been living at half volume for decades. Not because life was cruel, but because they were so afraid of the loneliness that comes with growth that they chose the loneliness that comes from self-abandonment instead. And that second kind of loneliness is quieter. It's more invisible, but it runs much deeper. Rogers believed that human beings have an innate movement toward growth, toward wholeness, toward what he simply called being more fully themselves. Not a perfect self, not an enlightened self, just a real one. A self that isn't arranged for applause, a self that isn't edited for safety, a self that doesn't constantly scan the room before it speaks. And he also believed, and this is the part that stings, that the greatest barrier to that growth isn't other people, it's the self-concept we've built to survive them. The image of yourself that was assembled, piece by piece, from what was accepted and what was rejected, what got you love and what got you silence, what made you useful to others and what made you invisible, the subtle calculations you learned to make before you were even aware you were making them, the tone you adjusted, the opinions you softened, the needs you postponed, the parts of you that felt inconvenient, intense, too much, or not enough, and were slowly placed out of sight. You've been carrying that image for years, maybe decades, and because it helped you belong, helped you avoid rejection, helped you secure connection when you needed it most, you mistook it for yourself, you defended it, you polished it, you tried to perfect it, you felt ashamed when it cracked, and growth, real growth, is the slow process of setting it down, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, consistent acts of honesty with yourself, in the quiet decision to stop pretending you're fine with things you're not fine with, in the even quieter decision to want something just because it's true for you, without needing it to be approved first, in noticing resentment and asking what boundary was never spoken, in noticing exhaustion and admitting what you've been sustaining that no longer feels alive. It often begins almost invisibly, a pause before saying yes, a sentence that comes out differently than it used to, a moment where you resist the urge to explain yourself into acceptability. These are small revolutions. They don't look impressive from the outside, but internally, they are tectonic. That process is beautiful, and it is lonely. Both things are true at the same time, because when you start setting that old image down, the people who love the image don't always know how to love what's underneath, and you can't blame them for that. You can mourn it, yes. You can grieve it deeply, but you can't make it their fault that they met a version of you that you were responsible for offering. There's a particular ache in that realization, the understanding that the gap between you and certain people isn't really about them at all, that you built a version of yourself that was easy for them to love, and now you're gently, irreversibly dismantling it. And the love they have is real. It's just aimed at someone who is slowly ceasing to exist. That's a complicated grief, because nothing dramatic happened. No betrayal, no explosion, just a quiet shift in alignment. You start speaking from a place that feels more grounded. You start declining what once felt obligatory. You stop laughing at jokes that land too close to something tender, and suddenly, there is space where there used to be ease. That's not a betrayal. It's just the truth of becoming. And some relationships can hold that transition. Some people, the rare ones, the remarkable ones, are capable of loving you through your becoming, of staying curious about who you're turning into rather than mourning who you were, of asking questions instead of making assumptions, of allowing your evolution without interpreting it as rejection. These people are worth everything. When you find them, you'll recognize them by the way you can breathe around them, by the way you don't have to translate yourself before you speak, by the way silence feels safe instead of threatening. They don't rush you back into familiarity. They don't demand the older version for their comfort. They meet you where you are, even when where you are is unfinished. But those people are not always the ones already in your life. Sometimes they're ahead of you, waiting in places you haven't been yet, in conversations you haven't had yet, in versions of yourself you haven't grown into yet. And here's what no one tells you about that. The waiting feels like emptiness. It feels like evidence that you made a wrong turn. It feels like you dismantled something functional for something uncertain. There are moments when belonging the old way seems easier than continuing forward, but it isn't emptiness. It's space, and space, even uncomfortable space, is what growth requires. Without space, there is no differentiation. Without differentiation, there is no self. The pause between identities is not a void, it is a corridor, and corridors are meant to be walked through, not decorated. And this is the part no one tells you. The loneliness of growth isn't punishment. It isn't proof that you're broken, or that your relationships were never real, or that being authentic leads to isolation. It isn't a cosmic consequence for daring to want something truer. It is simply what happens when you stop contorting yourself to fit spaces that were designed around who you used to be. It's a passage. It's the experience of moving from one version of yourself to another, and the temporary gap between who you were and who you're becoming. That gap feels empty sometimes, exposed, unwitnessed, like standing in a room after the furniture has been removed, but before anything new has arrived. Because the people who knew the old you can't fully see the new you yet, and the people who would recognize the new you haven't found them all yet. That's the gap. That's the loneliness, not permanent, but real. If this kind of conversation matters to you, if you find yourself returning to reflections like this one, subscribing to this channel means more of this will find you, and leaving a like tells something quiet and important, that this way of thinking about ourselves deserves more space in the world. If something in this video moved something in you, leave a comment. Not a performance of insight, just whatever is honestly true for you right now, because there's something Rogers returned to again and again. The idea that being truly heard, even once, even partially, changes something in a person, not because it fixes anything, but because it breaks the illusion that you're the only one feeling this, that your questions are uniquely flawed, that your restlessness is a defect, that your desire for depth is impractical. You're not the only one who has grown in a direction others couldn't follow. You're not the only one who has sat in a conversation feeling like a stranger in your own life. You're not the only one who has loved people sincerely while quietly knowing that who you're becoming requires a kind of space they might not be able to offer. That recognition, that you're not uniquely broken, that this loneliness is part of a real and human process, that recognition is not small. It's actually where integration begins. Not the integration of going back, not the integration of pretending the distance doesn't exist, but the integration of holding all of it at once. The love you have for people who can't follow you here, the grief of that gap, and the strange, stubborn aliveness of continuing to grow anyway. There's a kind of courage in that. Not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself or asks to be recognized. The quiet kind, the kind that shows up in the private moments when you choose honesty over comfort, depth over approval, becoming over belonging, even when belonging would feel so much easier. That courage doesn't always feel like courage. Most of the time it just feels like loneliness, like standing at the edge of something unfamiliar without a map and without company, like trusting a direction you can't fully justify yet, but you keep standing there. You keep choosing it. And even if you can't fully articulate why, some part of you knows. Some part of you knows that the version of yourself waiting on the other side of this passage is more real than anything you've left behind. More grounded, less fragmented, less exhausted from performing coherence. And one day, not today, maybe, but one day, the loneliness of this passage will feel less like abandonment and more like becoming. Not an arrival, just a becoming. The kind that doesn't stop. The kind that keeps asking more of you, keeps opening new gaps, keeps introducing you to newer and truer versions of yourself, each one a little less afraid, a little less performed, a little more whole. And the loneliness that comes with each of those passages, it never fully disappears, but it changes. It becomes less like isolation and more like solitude, less like being left behind and more like walking ahead, which is all any of us, honestly, are ever doing.